Hello friends. For today's video, we're going to be doing another new fantasy releases wrap up. And if you didn't see, just a quick heads up, for the first quarter of 2024, I am going to every now and then include new releases from 2023, but then once the second quarter kicks in, we will just be sticking to literally 2024 releases, and then any new fantasy from 2023 that I end up picking up, those will be discussed in my regular wrap-ups. But for today, we actually are going to be just discussing books that came out in 2023. A couple of these came out pretty much toward the end of the year, one of them really a few days before 2024. But regardless, if you are only interested in certain books or want to revisit a certain section, I will have timestamps. We're going to start with The Will of the Many, and then we'll get into Cage of Dreams, and then Ruthless Vows. So I'll have timestamps, like I said, in the description bar in case you'd like to skip ahead. I also did a whole in-depth non-spoiler review for The Will of the Many, so if you'd rather watch that, you can, instead of just getting overall thoughts. And then also, if you've already seen that video, you can skip ahead so you don't have to hear about it again. But starting with The Will of the Many, this is an adult fantasy, but honestly kind of fantasy science fiction book, sci-fantasy, and a lot of its themes, in my opinion, were its strengths. However, I also think to some degree the way in which the themes were executed, or you could almost say the way in which we didn't see much executed of the themes, at least in this first entry, I think were its weakness. So the setup is you have a society that the people at the top, and then also in general, because it is somewhat of a hierarchy, the people in the upper sections benefit from the literal will being taken from the people at the bottom. There are some people that are kind of more in the middle that voluntarily give up some of their will, and that benefits people at the very top. And by doing that and abiding by the law, essentially, they can continue to have their comforts, but they also allow for the people at the top to gain power from this will and inflict damage as they see fit on other countries, on certain groups of people. And so it is, by nature, set up in a way where some benefit more than others, to the point where some people live comfortably because of the suffering of others. And I think that's a really powerful concept to dissect, especially given the target audience are people who are by nature benefiting from a lot of the hardships that other people endure. A lot of us who live in countries like I do, I live in the US, so much of what, you get the point. I don't really need to dwell on this or be like, the world and the state it's in. But because those themes are so tied to what a lot of us can see in our own world, I was really excited to see the way in which we dissect them. And you are looking at a character named Vis, who clearly has a storied past, and you are kind of figuring out why Vis is in the position he's in and why he seems to be going against the system in some ways, but in other ways he is not wanting to commit acts of violence in order to change the way things are. But there are other people that want to use him as a vehicle of change, and then there are other people that want to take advantage of him for their own gain. So he's kind of caught in the middle, but he really wants to follow the principles that were instilled in him by some people in his past that, once again, you learn more about as you progress through the story. And the reason I say that I feel like the themes weren't executed to their fullest is because this story kind of just turns into a school setting to some degree, and the concept of the magic and using will, they're not allowed to do that at the school, so even the magic system wasn't expanded on much in this first entry. And I think that the other criticism I had, that I think a lot of people, even if they like the story, might see as something that it could have improved upon, which is just the perfection that is our main character. I mean, they're so good at everything that comes their way. They are able to, if something is not a thing they're familiar with, they're able to very quickly figure out how to not only use it, but be the best at it, to best other people that are supposedly really good at that thing or who have trained at that thing for their whole lives. And that was a little irritating, mostly because it made the book get to a point of predictability, unfortunately. There were some antagonistic characters that were really interesting, and I thought that when you do have those harder hitting emotional hits, I would say more so in, I think it was part 3 specifically, with the character's backstory, those were, I think, literally within the book, my favorite things about it. Those antagonistic characters that show up here and there, I'm like, these characters are really interesting, and they are the kind of people, so this is maybe an odd example, but for those of you that like Christopher Nolan's, you know, Batman movies, have you seen that thing about how the Joker is actually the real hero because the whole idea of having change for Gotham and making Gotham better and getting rid of all of these corrupt people, that the Joker technically did a better job of that than Batman did, and so thus is the Joker actually the hero. I'm sure you've heard those conversations before. If you haven't, they're interesting conversations to be had, but regardless, in some ways, that's kind of the feeling I got about some of the antagonistic characters, where you're like, oh, I don't like the things that they're doing, but maybe they're actually doing more than our character as far as in the long run fighting for change, but also I don't like their methods, so I don't want to do that. But then what is the solution? So I kind of liked those moral conundrums in this story. I think I will pick up the sequel and hope that my criticisms are remedied in that sequel and that we really see... I mean, there's some really explosive things that happen at the end, so that's also rather promising. And I want to add one more thing, which is that I think the friendship dynamics were quite well done also. So... kind of had mixed feelings about this one, especially I will say because so many people hyped it up and were saying this is one of the best things they've ever read. It's so good. Oh my gosh, it's like the new thing. And I'm really happy so many people have loved it and connected to it. I just think that the negatives for me made it just okay. And I would really be curious to see where we go from here, because if we go somewhere really powerful from there, I could see this being exceptional. For now, I would have liked to have seen some things done a little differently. I'll have my in-depth review if you're interested in hearing more thoughts, but I'm also very curious if you have read it or if you've been interested in reading it. What are your thoughts? Now moving on to the other books for today, we have Cage of Dreams. This is the sequel to City of Nightmares, which I loved when I picked it up. And the setup for City of Nightmares is that you have a society, which interestingly enough, since I just brought up Batman, it's kind of like, what if Gotham was bonkers? What if there were mayors flying around on giant pterodactyls, and that's how they stayed in power, and that's how they got rid of their political rivals? And what if there's just crime running rampant, and also sometimes people can turn into giant spiders and kill each other? So that's kind of the setup. And the reason being that something has occurred that when people go to sleep, if they have a nightmare, they can become that nightmare. And as a result, things have been done so that people can, when they drink the tap water, they won't dream, so thus they won't become nightmares, but accidents still happen, and so nightmares still do exist. And there's actually task forces that are meant to try and take out nightmares, but something that gets explored in the sequel is, what if people try to use nightmares to their benefit, to the point of, what if they try to make you fear certain things so that if you do have a nightmare, you have a specific one? And like that whole idea, I'm like, wow, what a weird, bizarre thing to explore. And also, just the creativity in the world building with this is fantastic. So an example is, a lot of people fear after watching a scary movie or something like that, they'll be afraid of vampires. But because people have a different view of what vampires are, because throughout the ages, the lore behind vampires changes. So if somebody does fall asleep and is afraid of vampires, they might turn into a different one than what somebody else would turn into. So somebody might have a weakness against garlic, whereas somebody might be sparkly. And if somebody turns into a nightmare and it's not actually a threat to the rest of society, they can just stay as a nightmare. So you have some people that are like part lizard, as an example. Some people's nightmares, though, I'm like, oh my gosh, that does sound terrifying. If your nightmares are germs, you can just turn into a germ and then nobody will ever know what happened to you. And I'm just like, oh, this book is making me want to have nightmares. So I just thought it was so creative and so unique. And in the sequel, you are looking a little bit more into the origin of the nightmares, and also the PTSD that our main character has experienced as a result of seeing nightmares within her own family, how they have personally affected her, and just the fact that they're all around her all the time. And I thought the way in which PTSD was represented was fantastic. That logical, okay, nothing's actually happening right in this moment, but I still feel afraid, and that kind of talking through that anxiety and that fear, I thought was really well done. I do think that the second one, I wish a little bit that an editor had said, hey, this sort of monologue your character is having through their thoughts in the narrative, we kind of just had this not too long ago, and I know you're trying to show growth, and so this is a thing that is constantly in their minds, but it's getting to a point where it's kind of repetitive. Maybe we should trim this one, or maybe we should cut this one out, because it did get to be a little bit repetitive. However, still loved this duology. I thought that this sequel, as soon as I started, I'm like, I'm happy to be back in this. It's just so absurd. I like how unique it is. I like that it's not like anything really I've picked up before. And I do also, I'm very excited because the way it ended, there's room for there to be potential other books in this world. Maybe not following the characters we saw here, but following different ones. And I would be very excited about that. So I hope it happens. And if you're somebody who you like fantasy that's different and unique and is trying new things, maybe give that one a go. Know that it's quite morbid and quite funny. So hopefully, if you pick it up, you enjoy it. Now to Ruthless Vows, and I'm actually going to go ahead and discuss Divine Rivals as well, as I've not had the chance to do anything dedicated to Divine Rivals in a new releases wrap-up. I did do a whole, I did a whole non-spoiler review dedicated to it, so I've talked about Divine Rivals. I just mean I never got the chance to mention it in a new fantasy releases wrap-up. So it and Ruthless Vows, probably in my top favorite series of all time at this point. I thought this duology was beautiful, exceptional. Its themes weren't just great themes to draw from, but the way they were executed. So kind of tying this full circle and juxtaposing this to The Will of the Many. The way in which these themes were represented, I thought was great. So much of this is about the heroism of people who are courageous enough to go to the front lines, who are courageous enough to go to war zones and tell the world what's really happening. And I'm getting emotional. Sorry. I'm getting emotional just thinking about that, because these are people who are not trained. They don't have weapons. Their voices and their writing is their weapon, but it's meant to change the world for the better. And oh my gosh, does this duology do that so well? And you see the way in which these characters have to put their lives on hold, and they really truly have their own things going on in their own lives, their own trauma, their own past experiences, their own personal grievances. And I thought that the way they were handled as individual characters, how the love interests really helped each other, really pushed each other, and also the friendships that were developed throughout the story, all of that was great while simultaneously representing the themes really, really well. The first book, in my opinion, might have been a little bit stronger than the second. I think mostly because this second one did kind of do a plot line from the first, but in reverse. And it didn't last the whole book, thank goodness. Otherwise, I think it would have been a bigger negative for me. But it was a little bit where I was like, oh, I mean, I see what we're doing. Can we be done with it now? And we did eventually finish it. But I just wish it hadn't lasted as long as it did. I still don't think it lasted so long to the point where I was upset or anything like that. I liked the idea of it. I just think it could have been better if it had not gone as long. Anyway, I had a part toward the end too, where you're seeing so many different characters. I actually recently did a whole video dedicated to rereading A Little Hatred by Joe Abercrombie. And there's a parallel between a section in that called Little People, where there's this climactic, violent event occurring. And Joe Abercrombie just shows the little people, just random people who are experiencing this event. Some of them are children, some of them are adults, some of them are rich, some of them are poor, some of them are somewhere in the middle. And you're seeing all these different people, and then it eventually ties back to one of the main characters. And in Ruthless Vows, they're not necessarily just random people. There are people that we have seen throughout the entirety of the duology. And once again, there is this climactic, violent event occurring, and you just get snippets of each of those people during this event. And that, I was like, this really took this second one up a notch from how I'd been feeling about it. I mean, I'd enjoyed the whole thing at that point, but that's what really, I thought, brought it home. Even though it was a very emotional moment, it's what it needed, I think, to really show the devastation, to really show that bittersweet nature of endings to stories. And I thought it did it so well. And then the very, very end, truly bittersweet, I think is a good way to describe the end of this duology. There's also just throughout the whole book, you're like, even if which I won't say, of course, I won't spoil anything, but you're like, even if, you know, let's say this book has a happy ending, things are great, you're like, there's just no way we're getting out of this completely unscathed. Like, something's gonna happen to some degree. Either, you know, like, there's gonna be just the town is destroyed and cities are destroyed, or people that the characters know are killed, or the characters are killed, or the characters live but then they have physical wounds from the result of everything that they've been through. You're like, the whole time you're like, there's no way that we are getting through this unscathed. And just that feeling throughout the book, I feel like is, you know, you don't want to have a book throughout the entirety of your reading experience be like, I mean, I know everybody's gonna be fine. And it depends on the book. Some books, you're like, okay, everything better turn out happy because that's what I need from this book. There are certainly books that are meant to do that. But I do think that when you have incredibly high stakes, when you have themes as serious as these ones, and when you're examining war and trauma, you just know that there's no way people get through it and they're the same as they were at the beginning. So I thought that that concept was done really well. In general, this duology, beautiful, touching. It's really, I mean, any positive word basically that I can think of to say is true of this duology. That's it for this new releases wrap up. If you're interested in checking out any of these books, I'll have them in the description bar down below. And also, I don't think I mentioned this in my last new fantasy releases wrap up, but I did make a whole playlist where I have just the new releases wrap-ups from last year. So if you want to see thoughts on anything that came out last year that I picked up, I'll have that in the description bar also. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.